2 decades on from the Hong Kong handover, its residents were promised freedoms, but many say Beijing is backtracking on its commitment. Will China's clampdown crush the city's democratic demands? I'm Imran Garda, and today's Newsmaker is Hong Kong. The sun was never meant to set on the British Empire. And yet, 20 years ago, the UK gave their last major colony back to China. For Beijing, Hong Kong's homecoming was a historic moment of national pride. The only catch was they had to agree to leave the territory's autonomy untouched for 50 years. That deadline's still 30 years away, yet many in Hong Kong feel China has already begun tightening its grip on the city. So while some celebrated the anniversary over the weekend, thousands of others protested, calling for Beijing to back off. But Chinese President Xi Jinping has made his position clear. Dissent will not be tolerated. So what recourse do Hong Kong residents have to fight for their rights? All this week we're focusing on Hong Kong, and we begin our special coverage with this report from Natalie Perhonen.
In China's most open city, July 1st has many meanings. Supporters of the central government in Beijing view it as the anniversary when Hong Kong was brought back into the embrace of the motherland.
It's the reunification of Hong Kong. This is why it's worth celebrating.
But for many locals, it's now a day of protest.
We need to have freedom of democracy. We didn't have so much before, but we have even less now.
What we see, what we citizens see, isn't the same as what the Chinese government sees. So it's our duty as citizens to tell the government what we want in our society.
And for some, that's a reminder of the past.
Why are you waving the flag today?
Oh, because I love British very much.
Numbers were down from previous years, but heat and humidity didn't stop thousands of Hong Kongers from coming out. People in this march are calling for many things: democracy, better education, workers' rights, and stopping developers from harming the environment. It is perhaps one of the clearest symbols of what many people in Hong Kong want to protect, and that is the right to protest and the right to have their voices heard. Hours earlier, Chinese President Xi Jinping inaugurated the city's new chief executive, Carrie Lam. One country, two systems in full show. In no other Chinese city would this take place. But the president also made sure to point out that open divisions in Hong Kong society are not doing the city or its people any favours.
It cannot afford to be torn apart by reckless moves or internal rifts. The people of Hong Kong must be united, work together and help each other. And by doing so, you will ensure the success of Hong Kong, your common home.
Hong Kong is one of Asia's most developed cities, but its version of democracy is just decades old. At the time of handover from Britain to China in 1997, a new law was brought in to govern Hong Kong as part of the one country, two systems model. Beijing would give the city a high degree of autonomy and also have minimal interference in the running of the territory's affairs for 50 years.
In the basic law, that's our constitution, the Chinese government promised that in the long run, our chief executive, that's like our president, and our legislative council, all members, that's like our parliament, will be elected by Hong Kong people through universal suffrage. And I think in the past 20 years, we have been struggling for the Chinese government to honor this promise.
Tai was one of the organisers of the Occupy movement, when protesters took to the streets for 79 days, calling for universal suffrage. And a time when the city's youth activists gained global prominence. While demonstrations did not bring change, they have sharpened the political will of many.
Delaying the promise of democracy is just proof that we are under the threat of China. But the uniqueness of Hong Kong would be, I would like to point out that the unique point of Hong Kong would be Hong Kong is the only city under the rule of Chinese government have certain degree of freedom and free flow of information.
The territory seems to be at a political crossroads about the best way forward. Pro-establishment lawmaker Holden Chow says the future will be bright, but only if opposition groups stop creating discord.
As long as they agree not to continue to ruin the trust between the two sides, then I think we will be fine. And I trust that the one country, two system principle is the best option, not only for Hong Kong, but also for the central government.
There's also another factor at play in Hong Kong's push for reform. It's open access to the outside world. Scarlett Pong describes herself as an independent councillor, but she's keenly aware political issues in the city can have reverberations in the mainland.
You know, there might be foreign power would like to step in Hong Kong as a stepping stone or a platform to affect China.
The political destiny of this city is uncertain. And in a place with such differing perspectives, it looks increasingly difficult that all sides will be able to set course in one direction. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers in Hong Kong.
Well, joining me now from Hong Kong is Emily Lau. She's a former member of the Legislative Council and used to lead the Democratic Party. And for The View from Beijing, we have Victor Gao. He's the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Thanks both of you for joining us. Emily Lau, if I had to give you a window into the future 20 years ago and had to show you the prosperity, the stability, the relative freedom to the mainland and the development that occurred in Hong Kong, you would take it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, of course. I think the Chinese government promised us one country, two systems. And the most important thing is that we will be able to preserve our free lifestyle and to progress to democratic government. And also, the communist rule in the mainland will not be spilled over to Hong Kong, because that's something that the Hong Kong people are very frightened of.
Victor Gao, young people feel as if it is spilling over. Many young people feel they didn't sign up to that social contract that was signed up 30 years ago, and they want change. Does Beijing respect that?
Well, change is to be welcomed if the change is positive and designed to promote a greater stability and prosperity in Hong Kong. We should not worry about change. We should care about how these changes will be brought about. I think from the Chinese perspective, in Beijing, from the central government's perspective, they want to make sure that the one country, two system will work. It has worked for the first 20 years. It will work for the coming 30 years. There are problems in Hong Kong which need to be overcome, but it does not take credit away from the viability and the sustainability of the one country, two system in Hong Kong.
Yeah, if you'll allow me to come in here. When people in Hong Kong see the disappearance of booksellers and a politically connected billionaire who's disappeared in the middle of the night, presumably plucked away from their beds by the mainland Chinese forces, it suggests to them that they're going the way of communist totalitarianism, maybe not in economics, but definitely in politics. Do you have sympathy with those in Hong Kong who fear that things are changing very fast and in the wrong direction?
I personally don't share that view at all. I would say the situation in Hong Kong has remained more or less the same as 20 years ago. If there are changes, 20 years ago, the British never gave Hong Kong any sense of democracy. However, there has been very deeply rooted tradition of rule of law. 20 years later, as of today, there is still rule of law in Hong Kong, even though it needs to be defended very fiercely, of course. and there has been much improved democracy in Hong Kong. Now, people may argue whether democracy in Hong Kong today is the best that they can get, whether there is still room for improvement. Of course, there is still room for improvement, but it will require sticking to the rule of law and make gradual steps forward, rather than try to achieve everything in one step at the cost of protecting the rule of law traditions in Hong Kong.
Okay, let me ask Emily Lau then. Chief Executive Carrie Lam, is she a puppet of Beijing, or does she have an independent political will as the Chief Executive?
Well, I think that many Hong Kong people are really, they want to give her the benefit of the doubt and hope that she will really live up to what she pledged. And the most important thing is whether Beijing will allow her to work with the pro-democracy politicians so that they can reach consensus on her proposals, and so that these proposals, whether they're bills or the budget or the policies, can get smoothly passed in the Legislative Council. So we will find out very soon, and whether she will be allowed to appoint people from all spectrum of political life to sit on the boards and committees of the government. But I cannot agree with Mr. Gao for saying there's still the rule of law. You know, only a few weeks ago, the British government came out to accuse the Chinese government of reneging, breaching the Sino-British Joint Declaration. This is over the Causeway Bay bookseller case. Mr. Li Bo, we all thought, agrees that he had been abducted. Somebody from the mainland had come to Hong Kong to abduct him. This is against one country, two system, and against the basic law. And now what do the Chinese government have to say? They say this Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was signed in December of 1984, they said it has no more relevance. It is just a piece of paper.
So let's ask.
So if that's the case,
I
don't know what other governments will want to sign any agreement with China from now on.
Right, that's a really good point. Let's bring in our guest from London now. It's Anson Chan. She served as the head of Hong Kong's civil service, both under the British colonial government and the Hong Kong SAR. Thanks for joining us, Ms. Chan. Is it just a historical document, this joint declaration? Can the Chinese just tear it up and throw it away?
Of course it isn't. It's a joint declaration signed by both Great Britain and China. And Britain must not allow China to tear up the joint declaration and walk away from its commitments to the people of Hong Kong.
Victor Gao, why are the Chinese giving this joint declaration so little relevance? Why aren't they taking it seriously? It was a very serious document that was a key part in the whole handover.
Now, I would say the joint declaration between China and the United Kingdom on the situation over Hong Kong was a very important document. And most of the terms in the joint declaration have been reincorporated in the basic law in Hong Kong, which is the highest law in Hong Kong. And I think the spokesman from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs most likely was meant to say that the joint declaration was a historical document signed between China and the United Kingdom, and the current law in Hong Kong, which governs all the aspects of the political life in Hong Kong, is the basic law. So we need to stick to the basic law rather than sticking to the original historical document of the joint declaration. Now, how to read the pronouncement of the foreign spokesman's position is open for question. But I think he meant to say that at present, only the basic law governs the political life in Hong Kong.
Fair enough. And you both interpret it differently. Let me ask Anson Chan, is that enough for you? And also, I mean, given that, hold on, given that the UK is so sort of small right now, it's not very powerful. Boris Johnson got a slap on the wrist when he mentioned that the joint declaration should be taken seriously. Should the UK government be doing more? And even if it wants to, can it really do more?
Absolutely. The British government should take a very firm lead. It should register its protest at the highest level with the Chinese authorities and get this matter clarified. I think Mr. Gao's argument is somewhat disingenuous. We all know that the provisions in the Basic Law are based on the principles laid down in the Joint Declaration, which two sovereign powers signed in 1984. And it has continuing validity, and I think Britain is absolutely right in saying it has a responsibility to continue to supervise the implementation of the Joint Declaration.
Emily Lau, in the long term, at the moment we have one country, two systems. In the long term, are we more likely to see two countries, two systems, or one country, one system, all run by Beijing and Hong Kong completely swallowed up?
Well, I think what they say is in the long term, we're all dead. So I think we concentrate on the foreseeable future. And Hong Kong people, most of them, would like to see one country, two systems. But the Chinese government keeping its promise. They cannot renege on the promise. And if they do that to Hong Kong people, do that to the UK, and to the international community, then what credibility does Beijing have? And who else, what other countries would want to sign agreement with China?
Okay, let me bring in what Xi Jinping actually said. And some would say this is a warning. Some would say this is just a sort of gentle reminder to Hong Kongers. Let's have a listen to what he said very recently.
Any attempt to endanger China's sovereignty and security, challenge the power of the central government and the authority of the Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, or use Hong Kong to carry out infiltration and sabotage activities against the mainland is an act that crosses the red line and is absolutely impermissible.
Anson Chan, did you take that as benevolent advice or as a threat?
Certainly not. I think Mr. Xi is laying down the law for Hong Kong people. He is saying that any challenge to sovereignty, to China's central authority, will not be tolerated because Hong Kong people would be, as it were, breaking the bottom line. In the past, at least leaders used to be somewhat more subtle in reminding Hong Kong people of its so-called responsibilities.
And Victor Gao, does Beijing see what's happening in Hong Kong as a litmus test for Tibet, for Xinjiang, and for every other possibly restive part of China? Is that why they take it so seriously?
No, I think Hong Kong is Hong Kong, and the one country, two system applies to Hong Kong and only to Hong Kong at this particular moment. You know, Macau is an exception. Macau has maintained stability for all these 18 years or so. Therefore, when we talk about Hong Kong, I think President Xi Jinping is very clear in expressing that there is a bottom line and no one should step on the bottom line without consequences. And I think, you know, while we talked about the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration, the Chinese government position is absolutely clear and has been made known to the whole world. That is, Britain has no right to interfere in anything in Hong Kong at all after 1997. That exactly is the basis for the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman who said that the Basic Law prevailed and Britain has no rule, no role at all under the Basic Law to further interfere in the local affairs of Hong Kong. And that is very clear. No one should allow Britain to point its finger again in local matters in Hong Kong.
Okay, final question for you, Anson Chan. We're running out of time. Is Hong Kong's freedom shrinking?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think we see a steady erosion of one country, two systems, a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong people, and a direct challenge to our core values and our lifestyle.
Okay. Emily Lau, Anson Chan, and Victor Gao, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much. Later this week, we continue our special coverage of Hong Kong with a look at the city's culture wars. How are its residents struggling to maintain their sense of identity? Up next on the Newsmakers, could this be the end of Al Jazeera? The Saudi-led bloc plans its next move as Qatar responds to the Gulf's demands. And is Afghanistan descending into chaos once again? We asked the journalist who literally wrote the book on the subject. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. The worst diplomatic crisis in the Gulf could soon be coming to a head. Saudi Arabia and its allies gave Qatar a 48-hour extension to comply with a list of demands in order to lift their blockade. They included shutting down Al Jazeera, closing a Turkish army base, and scaling back ties to Iran and so-called terror groups. In the past few weeks, Doha has publicly said the demands infringe on their sovereignty. And while they're willing to negotiate, they will not take orders from anyone. Well, Qatar has now delivered its official response. And on Wednesday, the Saudi bloc will plan their next move. So could Qatar leave the GCC? Could the Saudis send in troops? Shoaib Hassan takes a look.
Postponed at the last minute, the deadline for Qatar to comply with the demands of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Members led by Saudi Arabia have agreed to the request by mediators from Kuwait to delay the date by 48 hours. But the bloc has also refused to forego its demands, leaving even close ally, the United States, confused.
The more the time goes by, the more doubt is raised about the actions taken by Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Qatar calls the demands unfair and illegal.
The problem of the Gulf countries was Iran. We don't have the same size of trade of Emirates or Saudi or the other countries. Qatar has been on the 5th ranked as trade partner from the Gulf countries, and Emirates is located the 2nd international trade partner for Iran. If the problem is Iran, why those measures being taken against Qatar and not being taken against Iran?
It was remarks attributed to the Qatari Emir, allegedly praising the Saudis' regional rival that ignited the crisis. But experts say the ferocity of the GCC's reaction is because they see Doha's pursuit of an independent foreign policy as a provocation.
They have their own also little reasons. The Saudis, they want to see Qatar under their fold, because everybody else is under the Saudi fold.
Qatar insists that will not happen, but it's increasingly looking isolated as Saudi Arabia holds the strongest cards in the dispute. It has closed down Doha's only land border and restricted airspace for flights to and from Qatar. And now it is moving to freeze Qatar's assets in regional banks and investment firms. That's a move that could checkmate the country's defenses. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Riyadh by Saudi and Gulf Affairs analyst Mohammed Al-Qubayban. In London, we have Sultan Barakat. He's the founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. And with me here in the studio is TRT World's editor-at-large, Ahmed Al-Burai. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Mohammed Al-Qubayban, the fact that there has been an extension suggests that Saudi and the GCC are rethinking this blockade, rethinking their demands, and maybe there'll be some sort of compromise. Is that how you see it?
No, I'm optimistic anyhow. I think the effort being done around the world, especially from the Kuwaitis, Sheikh Sabah, I think an understanding also the Qataris problem after this few days again, I think that I'm optimistic and problem will be solved. The 48 hours being asked from the Kuwaitis or by the Qataris extension to read more and sit up and think, well, it gives you an indication. 48 hours, what has to do? I mean, we're not going to exam or we're not giving somebody a chance to fix his behavior. No, those are governments and the crisis is bigger than 48 hours. But what my thinking about that the Qataris will have to go sooner or later with the demands that the GCC countries, the 3 countries and Egypt ask. And you knew, sir, there is some, I think, update events happening last night. You knew that Mr. Trump was talking directly to the phone to Prince Tamim. And I think that call will have a lot of things inside it. There will be lots of changes. But again, I'm not feeling that it will be continue like this. I'm really feeling optimistic that the Qataris will understand.
Okay, so Sultan Barakat, Mohammed Al-Qubayban is optimistic that the Qataris will eventually cave in, I guess. He has a cautious optimism. The Qataris have always said those 13 demands were designed to be rejected because it went too far. What do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, I agree with millions around the world who think the whole process has been totally irrational, right from day one, to spring out a blockade of that magnitude on a neighboring country, a country that is a member of the GCC, was really out of this world. And I think it came as a shock to a lot of policy observers and analysts around the world. Having said that, I think the 48-hour extension does give some positive signals on both sides. First, it shows that the Saudi and the Emiratis have a degree of flexibility and they are willing to wait and listen to what Qatar has to say. And it also shows that the Qataris have not rejected entirely the 13 demands, but they are maybe working on some kind of more detailed response to emerge in the coming couple of days.
Ahmed Al-Buraid, there's been an upsurge in nationalism within Qatar. Images of the Emir, Tamim, the country itself being very strong, doubling down on its rejection of those demands. Qatar is a small country, but a rich country, and it has some friends. But does it have as many friends as it thinks it has in order to continue to push back against these demands from the GCC and the Saudis, or is it playing dangerously?
The absurdity or the lunacy of the whole crisis went viral on the Twitter and social media outlets. If you just go and see how the Saudis are portraying what's going to happen in Qatar, liberating Qatar is one of the hashtags. The other hashtag is it's approaching Qatar, be careful. One of the very prominent journalists in Saudi Arabia, who is very close to the royal family, is saying, I wish they decline the whole list so they will see what is the consequence. So Qatar absolutely is a very small country, but it does have the soft power in the region. They do have great relations with Turkey. From the one hand, the move of Turkey by deploying the military and their soldiers in Qatar in the military base was a checkmate move, if you will, to the whole region, that Turkey is not going to concede or abandon its relations with Qatar. But on the other hand, what's happening now, I disagree with the point that we should be cautiously optimistic, because its deadlines never work in negotiation and peaceful. If they have the will, the political will to negotiate the 13 items, they wouldn't give extension for 48 hours.
Mohammed Al-Qubayban, why give deadlines? Why give ultimatums? Why not talk directly to the Qataris and its friends or middlemen, whether it's the Kuwaitis, whether it's Turkey? Why not talk on equal terms instead of throwing down these deadlines and ultimatums and then extending them? Why not have proper dialogue?
Wallahi, sir, I just want to tell you, maybe the two gentlemen here, I don't see them, but anyway, good evening to both of them, Barakat and Ahmed. I think they did not read the problem since 1996. If we're talking about hysterical, Barakat was saying this is irrational demand, and Ahmed, he said very valid point that the Qataris has to use their soft power. And why we don't talk directly, I think, sir, the problem is being on the table the minute as let's say the Arab Spring started and the Al Jazeera start broadcasting by negative way, rather than to show the whole world this is the Arabs are moving forward and they want to shift their lives. They took it from the different side. And here is the problem start. The Saudis talk directly. I've been in Qatar 100 times. We discuss these issues with our friends, and coming to the governments, they've been discussing it. So the problem is not 1 year or 2 years. No, I'm saying it's beginning of 1996. The problem started. When Al Jazeera start picky at problems, a small problem in Saudi, they make it a hill. small problem in Kuwait, especially the Arab neighboring country. And
I'm interested because you mentioned Al Jazeera twice now. No, it's interesting, sir. You mentioned Al Jazeera twice. And just in the interest of clarity, are you talking about Jazeera as an entire network? Are you talking about Al Jazeera Arabic as a channel? Are you talking about Mubashir, Al Jazeera English? Which one in particular? And is it because of Al Jazeera and its policies to GCC countries, or Al Jazeera and its general coverage?
No, sir. No. Please don't misread me this way.
I'm
but
asking
I'm
you
saying
to
this is the problem start.
Sure.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. I'm talking about Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English, and I'm talking about Mubashir.
Okay.
So I'm not talking about as a channel itself. No, I'm talking about as a system. This is none in our society being happens. We're different than the Western people. Yes, you may say something to the governments, but our Islamic rules is we have to respect. We've been directed to respect whoever is in the bus. So Al Jazeera did not read.
Sure. Allow me to come in here. I worked for Al Jazeera for about 10 years. I never once got an edict or a mandate to go and hurt the Saudis, to hurt the Emiratis, to try and make them look bad. My mandate, mainly at Al Jazeera English, was to be a good journalist and try and do the best I could. We were never in there to manipulate anything against the GCC countries. We were never aware of some sort of system designed to push back against that. Was I just naive?
I hope, yeah, sir, maybe you're talking about the English, but I was watching the English too.
Okay. But you
I
said
think
the English,
that was...
You said the English and the Arabic.
Yeah, I'm saying all. If we look at the news, we don't want to go back and just debate in something almost 15 years ago. No, but this is the reality. What I'm saying is a small problem. They are making it a bigger problem. Not the idea of passing the information to the viewers. No, is behind it. I've read it. Many people read it. That they are trying to push the
government
population.
In Venezuela. They do that about the government in Turkey. They do it about every country because news follows problems, right? Should they only report on everybody else's problems and not your problems?
No, that's not true. They do it in other countries. I mean, what we give a damn, sorry for this, why we care about what's happening there in Venezuela. If it's a problem that there is a problem, it's nice to know, but the problem was from Al Jazeera and other, let's say, media belong to a Qatar government. They were trying to give a wrong, let's say, image and forcing people to create, to start moving around the governments, trying to push people, which is they are driving to a chaos.
Okay.
That's how I read it. That's what most people read
and I think, and to be fair to you, you reflect a sentiment that's across the GCC at the moment. Sultan Barakat, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I actually agree that the issue goes back to 1995, not even 1996. And it is when Qatar made a conscious decision to break away from the satellite of Saudi Arabia. Qatar has been under the thumb of Saudi Arabia for many decades before then, ever since the British left the Gulf. And they have reached a conclusion that their own development is better served by forcing their way out and by forging a new independent foreign policy, which they have done rather successfully. And they have also developed their own economics. Their dependence on liquefied gas have allowed them to break away from pipelines and deliveries and so on. So you could see from the Saudi perspective that is very annoying, and I understand that. But from a Qatari perspective, it is what have driven their development at an incredible speed ever since 1995. People still live around and they can remember the days before 1995 when the country was in debt, and now when it has hundreds of billions of dollars in assets that allows it to cope with this blockade and other circumstances. So I think we have to be very rational about their own choice. Now they've made the choice and they moved that way. Now Al Jazeera for me is just a tool. Al Jazeera, originally the whole idea of Al Jazeera and an English news channel, an Arabic news channel that was made to imitate CNN in those days, was meant to be a Saudi-British enterprise, and that failed, and then Qatar moved in and they took on Al Jazeera. Now, I don't think we can blame everything on what Al Jazeera has done or doing. Although I do agree that during the Arab Spring, particularly Al Jazeera Arabic, I think went a little bit off tangent. They became very emotive. The reporting had some problems with it and so on. But overall, this is a media outlet where we have a new culture in the world, we have a new culture in the region that allows freedom of speech. The Saudis and the Emiratis and others have also established their own outlets. They have tried to compete with Al Jazeera. They are continuing to compete with Al Jazeera. I think they are legitimate to do so. They can edit their own programs, do their own presentations, so on. The problem, I think, is in the sources of making the news. I mean, we have to be very honest that some countries in the region have really resisted any degree of reform, and it is this what makes the news and what gives rise to Al Jazeera reporting.
Yeah, and that's one of the arguments of the Qataris. Yes, of course, and of course, those who defend freedom of the media say, yeah, all media is flawed, including Al Jazeera, but if you're going to shut them all down, if you're going to shut down media for being flawed, you're going to shut down, well, most of them, I guess. Ahmed Al-Buraib, just before we end, I've got a couple more questions, so briefly, please. So are we seeing the emergence of two camps here? On the one hand, you have the Qataris and Turkey and maybe the Iranians, maybe even the Russians on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the Saudi, GCC countries, Egypt, maybe the Americans. The Americans are wavering a little bit as well. Are we seeing two camps develop?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a kind of polarization, and it's very clear. The manifestations are very clear. Now you have Turkey from the one hand. You're pushing Qatar by a way or another, the same as you did to Hamas, to leave or to depart from the Sunni orbit, if you will, and move to the Shiite orbit, to Iran, mainly because the Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis are not able to embrace Qatar. Qatar is not that kind of a rogue state that is completely disagreeing with all the policies. They've been the allies in Yemen. They've been the allies in Syria. They have much in common. But the problem is these two countries are by far pushing them. They want them to be a vassal state by the literal meaning of the word.
Okay, now I want one final question for Mohammed Al-Qubayban, because he's the one guest, in the Saudi camp here. Mohammed, would you be happy if the Emir, Sheikh Tamim, was overthrown and Saudi tanks rolled across the border and there was regime change in Qatar? Would you be happy?
Of course not, sir. What you're saying, I mean, that's non-rational question, by the way, or non-rational point.
No, many Saudis are calling for it, so I'm asking whether you're calling for it as well.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm telling you, we're almost one house, and we have different ideas. We're not maybe agreeing with the policies that they are doing, but they are still, we're tribes. Maybe you've been, as you said, in Qatar, so you saw the Saudis. And by the way, most of the national Saudis people, they're still okay with each other, but this is a government problem. But what I want to say, we never push the Qataris government toward the borders or to push them to the corner to give decisions that we want. I completely disagree with Mr. Ahmed, what he was talking about. Sir, Qatar is not a country from 100 years or 200 years. They are neighboring us. No, that's more than 300 years, and they are tribes. So we know Qatar before, maybe during the Ottoman Empire, empire. But the problem is, the unfortunate things happen that Sheikh Tamim, to me, how I read it, he's not the one who is running the government. There is somebody is running the government behind him by force, by friendly.
Who is
that?
that?
From the royal family. Yeah, from the family. His dad, by the way, and the let's say foreign ministers, Sheikh I think Hamad, and other members. Okay. And the problem is that the Qataris thought that though they are with us in Al-Hazm, Asifat Al-Hazm in Yemen, in Syria, that they thought this will let the Egypt, Saudi, Bahrain, and Emirates will never look at what other problems they're doing. Okay. As we're saying, intervening in these inside policies, supporting Muslim brothers being requested by the Egypt government.
Right.
So lots of
okay, and those
issues
are the 30
here.
demands.
Maybe the program was.
Okay, and those are the 30 demands.
But what I'm saying, the program is not enough. I hope that we find sometimes later And I hope the broadcast will be live. Then at least I see you and I see my friends there. It will be more exciting.
Okay, we'd love to have you in studio sometime.
Thank you very much to you.
Okay, we're gonna give you a call. Hopefully we'll have you in studio
thank
sometime soon. It's good to have you on the program again, Mohammed Al Qubayban, Sultan Barakat, and Ahmed Al Burai. Thank you.
Extremism, including Daesh, some increased under the US presidency of Afghanistan, during the US presidency of Afghanistan, some were created in Afghanistan, in the US presidency, during the US presidency. Daesh was created there.
So they knew, but they did nothing?
They not only knew, they watched.
At what point does watching become supporting?
From the very beginning.
That was from my interview with Hamid Karzai last week, where he told me that both the US and Pakistan have played a role in Afghanistan's recent instability by supporting terror groups. He also wouldn't be drawn into whether current President Ashraf Ghani bears any responsibility for the deteriorating security situation. Well, last week, NATO allies agreed to send more troops into Afghanistan, but with the Taliban controlling so much territory, is the only way to a political solution by including them, even as they conduct daily attacks against Afghans. Let's ask the man who wrote one of the definitive books on the Taliban. He is also the author of Descent into Chaos, charting the aftermath of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and Pakistan on the brink. Joining me now from Madrid, Spain, is Ahmed Rashid. Thanks so much for joining us, sir. I spoke with Hamid Karzai. You would have heard some of that. He told me he made no distinction between the United States and Daesh, and he also said that the US facilitated, supported, did nothing with regards to the rise of Daesh in Afghanistan. Is he making a good point, or has he lost his mind?
No, I don't think the US was involved in the creation of Daesh in Afghanistan or anywhere else. But certainly the US did tend to ignore the issue until only recently. The fact is that Daesh has been operative in Pakistan and in Afghanistan for the last 2 years. Some of it has been generated by local people, people fed up with their own Islamic extremist groups and wanting to be part of what they see as a new group and a new philosophy. And partly the actions being taken by the Arab leaders in Daesh leaders in Iraq and Syria, who are looking at Afghanistan and Pakistan as a possible new safe haven for if they are fully defeated in the Middle East. This is an area that they can retreat to. And certainly that's why that they would like to see, they would like to control much more territory in Afghanistan than they do now. And that's why they're a threat.
The US dropping what they call the mother of all bombs against Daesh in Nangarhar, was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it was a very bad thing. First of all, it was relegating Afghanistan to a kind of testing ground for new weaponry by the US, which is always a very bad signal to send. The Soviets did it in the 1980s. They tested all their new weapons on the Afghan people, in which many people died. So I think that was a very bad idea. And it seems that the intelligence was very poor, because I don't think they killed a large number of people. They didn't kill any Daesh leaders. It doesn't seem that the Afghan Daesh was even present in those tunnel complexes.
I want to talk about the May the 31st attack, which was within Kabul. Horrendous attack, more than 150 people killed, more than 400 injured. Afghanistan's Interior Ministry blaming Pakistan's ISI as being the hand behind it. They say the ISI controlled the Haqqani network, which in turn did the attack. I asked Hamid Karzai about it. He wouldn't be drawn into sort of the exact attack and whether Pakistan did the exact attack, but he said in general, yes, Pakistan is still sponsoring terror in Afghanistan. Do you believe Pakistan is still sponsoring terror in Afghanistan?
Well, unfortunately, perhaps I won't go as far as that, but what I will say is that Pakistan is giving sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban, to the Haqqani group. All these people, the leadership of the Taliban holds its meetings and lives in Pakistan. Their families are there, their businesses, their kids go to school there. And unfortunately, there is now a strong movement within the Taliban, which I call a kind of peace lobby, those who want to open a dialogue with the Kabul government. And Pakistan has really done very little to facilitate that. Much more, you know, Pakistan, after all, these Taliban are living in Pakistan. There's a certain pressure that Pakistan can bring to bear to put these Taliban into a negotiating position with Kabul. Now, we did have an attempt 2 years ago with China, the US, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, having one round of talks with the Taliban, but they never went anywhere, largely because the Taliban have always said that they are not free. The peace lobby has always said that they are not free to talk with Kabul as long as they are based in Pakistan. Many of them left Pakistan. Some of them went to Qatar, where the Taliban opened an office. Some of them went to other Gulf states. But there needs to be a conclusive effort to bring all these who belong to the peace lobby amongst the Taliban, allow them access to meet with other Taliban and come to some kind of consensus to open a dialogue with Kabul.
Now, the Taliban controls 2/3 of Helmand province, more than a quarter of the entire country. You say there's a peace lobby within the Taliban. Many would ask, how do you distinguish between the peace lobby of the Taliban and the more brutal version of the Taliban? Is any political solution going to have to include the Taliban in some way, shape, or form?
There's absolutely no doubt that any political solution will have to include the Taliban, and even the opposition in Kabul, the political opposition to President Ghani and formerly the opposition to President Karzai, now accept the fact that there has to be a dialogue with the Taliban. There has to be some kind of inclusive government formed between the two sides. But I think now much more critical to the crisis in Afghanistan is, you know, on the one hand, you've emphasized the military crisis, which is very true, but there's a real political crisis now. President Ashraf Ghani is very isolated. His partner, Abdullah, who's supposed to be the, if you like, vice president or chief executive officer, is refusing to work with him. There is a very strong opposition made up of non-Pashtun groups, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, who have in fact just signed an agreement in Turkey at the house of General Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek commander, who has an exile home in Turkey. They have just agreed to join hands. Remember that all these warlords and these politicians have been at odds with one another, as well as being at odds with the government. Now they seem to be joining hands and insisting that President Ghani change his methodology and initiate a reform program, and they want a more inclusive government. So you have a real political crisis now, and the Americans, NATO, none of the big countries really have an answer to this. And of course, this political crisis is only helping the Taliban, because the Taliban then point out and say, look, what a mess there is in Kabul. The government is hopeless. The opposition is trying to unseat the government. And so we are a much better option than anyone else.
So, political crisis, political vacuum. President Ghani doesn't have complete control over his country. There's machinations. Others are moving to try and unseat him and so on. You spoke about Turkey. Hekmatyar has gone back to Kabul. There's all sorts of movements, right? And then back to the military issue. The US is saying we want to inject a few thousand more troops into the country. General Mattis is spearheading this. It seems as if Donald Trump is leaving Mattis to take care of Afghanistan for him, and his answer is more troops. Is that going to help or harm the situation?
No, I don't think it's going to help the situation. Sending 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 more troops is not going to change the military situation on the ground. And on the other hand, it's not going to resolve the political crisis in Kabul and in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the real issue with the Donald Trump administration is that everything has been handed over to the military, whether it's Syria or Iraq or Yemen or Somalia or Afghanistan. All these, what should be political issues, which need diplomatic work, which needs the State Department, and which needs other arms of the US government like AID, the Agency for International Development, but in particularly the State Department. None of these organizations are active with the Trump administration. For example, we don't have an American ambassador in Kabul. There's no American ambassador in Pakistan either. So until the Trump administration gets its realizes that this is a multi-dimensional problem that needs to be tackled by all arms of the US government, not just by the military, I don't think we are going to see much success.
Is Afghanistan firmly back in a state of chaos? Because it seemed, you wrote descent into chaos, it seemed as if for a little while it was coming out of chaos. Is it firmly back in chaos?
Unfortunately, I mean, I have never seen Afghanistan so bad, even during the Soviet occupation. The Taliban and their allies are launching suicide attacks and terrorist attacks almost every single day. We are having massive civilian and military casualties on the Afghan side. There's an economic crisis with, as you know very well in Turkey, tens of thousands of Afghans left Afghanistan and traveled through Turkey to Europe in a bid to try and get to Europe. Last year, it's continuing this year also. And there's an economic crisis without money, and as I've described, there's a political crisis. And nobody is really coming up with any kind of solution, least of all the Afghans, unfortunately.
Depressing situation in Afghanistan. So it's been a pleasure talking to you, Ahmed Rashid. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.